Hello everybody, my name is Katharina Edmaier. I'm the colleague of Caroline Scherp. I work at the Federal Office for the Environment since 2015. For 5 years I was in the Water Division, and since last summer I work in the Hazard Prevention Division and the Flood Protection section. Also, I do regret that we cannot exchange live and interaction cannot take place. Nevertheless, we will try to give our best to make a clear overview of the flood protection situation in Switzerland. Here you can see an overview of my presentation. First, I would like to talk about the importance of hazard maps as a basis for protection measures. After that, I will go into more detail about flood protection measures in Switzerland. We distinguish between three main concepts of measures, which is the planning measures, technical measures, and organizational measures. When I talk about the technical measures, I want to make a reference to the importance of riparian ecosystems and why and how we protect them and include them in our flood protection concepts. And in the end, I want to present challenges that we currently deal with and draw some conclusions. So let's start with the risk assessment and hazard maps. In Switzerland, we are dealing with different flooding processes, as I can imagine are you as well. We do not have any oceans in Switzerland. This is a type of hazard that you might deal a lot with, that we absolutely lack in experience with. But still the diversity of processes is quite wide and is illustrated in this slide. As my colleague already said earlier, we have different definitions of risk, damage, and natural hazards. We define risk as the probability of occurrence of a dangerous natural process, in our case floods, times the damage extent. The damage extent is described by the value of assets, the vulnerability, and the exposure to a natural hazard. Natural hazard is defined as the possibility of occurrence of a natural process or event that affects areas that are used by human beings or used by human activity. Flood intensity maps show in high detail the magnitude of inundation for a given return period or frequency. They show a detailed assessment of flood depth and also the sediment accumulation for different flood intensities. So we do not only consider the inundation of water, but also the debris flow and deposition. Criteria for intensities depend on the process we look at. For example, for a static inundation, the strong intensity would be a depth of more than 2 meters water. For dynamic inundation, it's the product of the velocity of the water and the depth that must be over 2 in order to have a strong intensity. What we do now with those intensity maps is that we look, as I said before, for different frequency. For example, here we have a 30-year flood, we have a 100-year flood, a 300 flood, and an extreme event. And then we plot those against the probability of occurrence, which then in the end gives us the hazard maps. The hazard maps help us to find our hotspots and to identify where we have a need for action. They give a very detailed overview. They have a quite high precision, and usually we use, as I said before, the return periods 30, 100, 300 years, and the extreme event, which usually is more or less 1,000 years. It's getting not so exact there anymore. The scale usually that we use in Switzerland is 1 to 5,000. And it's the basis for land use planning and also for all the protection measures we take in action. In Switzerland, hazard mapping started quite early in the 50s with mapping avalanches. In the meantime, hazard maps are really the basis for hazard protection measures. Also, there were quite some chances already to verify flood maps, and they were proven to be quite reliable. But it's very important, and Caroline also emphasized that they need to be verified and, if necessary, revised after each major event, and also after the implementation of measures which change the risk situation. Let's now come to the flood protection measures. First of all, it's important that the dimensioning of flood protection measures is based on the protection targets. These vary depending on the object of protection. So, for example, if you have a settlement where people are living, this is subject to a higher protection level than agricultural land. We aim at a high protection level for high value assets or high danger of human life. I mentioned before that we have three main concepts of flood protection measures. So I will now present those three concepts, and I will start with the spatial planning measures. For us, in our point of view, it's the first and best strategy to avoid constructing new buildings and facilities in areas with significant natural hazards. And according to the federal law, flood protection should primarily be ensured through the maintenance of water bodies and through spatial planning measures. The guiding principle of spatial planning measures is no development in vulnerable areas and relocation of vulnerable structures to safer areas if necessary and possible. We distinguish, after our hazard maps, 4 different zones. The red zone is the area where strong intensities occur. So we can assume substantial danger for constructions and people inside houses. New constructions are not allowed in the red zone. Within the blue zone, we assume a medium danger level. Constructions are allowed, but only with restrictions. In the yellow zone, usually no restrictions are given, depending on the canton. But there is recommendations and informations for landowners within the yellow zone. The yellow-white zone is called the zone of remaining danger, and it is recommended to pay attention, especially for special and vulnerable objects, and the planning of emergency measures is significant within this area. Red and blue zones are in general strictly implemented in practice by all cantons in Switzerland. Restrictions are rarely put in place, on the other hand, for yellow and yellow-white zones. As also Caroline already pointed out before, with increasing land use, which we had in the last centuries in Switzerland. Switzerland is very highly populated. We have a higher exposure of values, and we have a higher vulnerability of our systems. So the risk depends primarily on the land use rather than on the hazard level. And we observe high risks in densely populated and intensively used areas. Those are mainly the areas we need to protect from flooding and from flooding. So I have also an example of special planning measures. It's the village Frana di Rossiro in Ticino. There's an industrial area, you can see it here, and it is situated just below a landslide area. You can see the starting landslides up here. So there's the industry just below. And the main part of this industry could be relocated to the other side of the valley. Of course, you need alternative locations for this measure with same or similar conditions, and this is not always the case. Let's go on to the technical measures. Although spatial planning measures are preferable, we have a lot of buildings, industry, infrastructure, which is already in areas of danger. And this is where also technical measures must be implemented. As I said before, I would like to give a short insertion on the importance of riparian ecosystems. So I show you here a picture of a Swiss river. And natural riparian ecosystems are characterized by a flat corridor with a riverbed, a land-water transition area, and a floodplain, which you see here in the back. The diversity in natural riparian ecosystems is huge. Width and depth of the water body vary. There's different flow areas in terms of the flow velocity. The bottom substrate varies in terms of grain size. There's riverbank structures with steep banks that serve maybe as nesting sites for birds, shallow banks that allow mammals to reach the water. So we have a huge habitat diversity, and as well is the species diversity. This photo here shows the River Rhine, not so far from its source, but the importance of riparian ecosystems, I think, is a global issue. This is also shown by the WWF Living Planet report, which is published every 2 years and gives an overview of the condition of ecosystems and species all over the world. And also the Living Planet Report 2020 points out that freshwater populations declined by 84% on average between 1970 and 2016. This is the strongest average population decline of all ecosystems. So in conclusion, we see that rivers and streams are very important habitats for many different species. At the same time, they are under strong pressure. Thus, there's a need for action to protect stream ecosystems, and we must try not to put them under even more pressure through hydraulic engineering. For this reason, the protection of the riparian ecosystem is implemented in the Swiss Flood Protection Act. It says that the natural course of rivers and streams must be maintained or restored as far as possible within hydraulic engineering projects. Water courses and spaces provided for water must be designed so that they can serve as a habitat for a wide variety of flora and fauna. The interactions between the surface and subsurface water are largely preserved, and riparian vegetation appropriate to the site can flourish. Also, additional to this, of course, we try to use soil bioengineering measures when possible and adequate. Now let's come to the measures, to the technical measures. We have different concepts or types of technical flood protection measures, which is the retention, so hold back water or debris, which is the channel out method to try to divert the water away from the area that should be protected, and the channel through. So we try to bring all the water and debris in the stream. First, I would like to present the channel through method. It means to create sufficient flow capacity to pass through water and debris. This method was implemented on the lowest section of the Gliessibach in Brienz in the canton of Bern. There, a large debris flow event occurred in 2005 after long-lasting precipitation. 28 residential buildings and the community center situated on the alluvial cone, this is the community center here, were damaged. Unfortunately, also 2 people lost their lives. Among other measures, above the alluvial cone near Brienz, a large 20 to 40 meter wide drainage corridor was built through the whole village of Brienz. And the aim is that the channel has such a large capacity that debris flow can be diverted into the lake of Brienz. You see the lake here. Even in big events, sorry. And that there is also sufficient space in the channel for sedimentation in case that a debris flow would stop. For the implementation of this measure, several destroyed buildings could not be rebuilt at their original location, which you can see in this picture here. Our experience says that channel through measures can be expensive, especially if debris flow is involved. For sure, they require space. This space is often not available in relatively densely built up Switzerland, and implementation is in those cases only possible, as in the case of Brienz, if buildings along the stream have been destroyed. When enough space is available, this can be a good strategy to also enhance the ecological situation, especially if the channel can be widened and new habitats created. Let's come to the next type of measure, the channel out measure. It means surrounding the danger zone by the flow and by the debris. The channel out strategy is currently being planned in Switzerland in the Illgraben, in the municipality of Leuk in Canton Valais. Very large debris flow occur there quite frequently. And on the right side of the alluvial cone, which is here, lies the village of Susten. The strategy for the Illgraben is now to allow only those debris flows to flow down the existing channel that can be discharged without damage within the existing channel capacity. Debris flow which exceeds the existing discharge capacity should be diverted onto the left in the undeveloped part of the alluvial cone. The diversion structure is technically very demanding. The experience with such diversions is not yet very large in Switzerland, since there are not yet many realized projects. However, it has been shown that the diversion of bedload and debris flow is much more complex than the diversion of pure runoff, of pure water. Physical model tests are indispensable in this case in order to define dimensioning and functioning of such structures. Let's come to the retention of bedload, to the retention measures in general. So bedload can be retained either in the catchment above, so through afforestation, through slope stabilization or check dams, or at the neck of the cone in bedload traps. I want to give you also here an example. This is the example of the Guppenrunse in Canton of Glarus. It's a retention of bedload. In 2011 and 2012, 2 large debris flows occurred here in the Guppenrunse in this stream. These destroyed a large part of the already 100-year-old barrier stairs, which stabilized the stream before. And after this event, the responsibles decided to restore only 3 most important barriers and to create 2 bedload retention basins at the cone neck. The risk can be reduced significantly like this, and the system is expected to show a high robustness. The experience with this retention basins and the cone neck is that they are very efficient measures and that they have a large potential of retention. Also, the behavior in case of overload, meaning very extreme events, can often be controlled relatively well. The disadvantage is that you have a lot of maintenance. There is regular emptying that needs to be done, which causes costs and which causes also awareness. Now, the last technical measure I want to present is the retention of water. There we have two possibilities, either through reservoirs or by basins. Water retention in lake reservoirs can be of great advantage because great or large volumes of water can be retained, as illustrated here for the Siersee in Canton Schwyz. Retention in the lake of Sier, this is the Siersee here, can reduce the peak runoff in the city of Zurich, which lies here. Lake regulations require massive regulation constructions and the presence of appropriate topography or natural lakes is a condition. On the other hand, regulation can also be used for hydropower generation. This can be a win-win situation as well as a potential conflict. Another conflict that we see in Switzerland is with navigation. So when natural lakes are not available or cannot be used for the regulation, a water retention can also be ensured with basins. The volumes for retention are correspondingly smaller in comparison to the lakes, of course. Often, also here, the topographical situation can be used. Nevertheless, structures are necessary to ensure the inflow into and or the outflow out of the basin. Often also dams are necessary, as can be seen in this example of the Eichmatt Basin at the River Warna in Canton of Luzern. So you can see one of the dams, for example, here. So I want to come to the third concept of measures, which are the organizational measures. Those are prepared and rehearsed activities carried out before and during an event to limit the extent of damage. These include forecasting, warning, alerting, closing off affected areas, setting up mobile protective measures, and evacuating and caring for affected persons. These measures must be prepared, regularly revised, and practiced as a part of emergency plans. A basic requirement for organizational measures is a precise and on-time warning. To this aim, forecasts, in case of floods, for example, precipitation and runoff forecasts, are supplemented with on-site observations and assessed in the local context. For this purpose, local natural hazard advisors with very good knowledge of local conditions are trained in Switzerland. They assume an advisory role in their communities and preparedness and during an event, but also in damage analysis. This figure shows the cascade of actions during an event for all levels of administrations in Switzerland, which Caroline presented before. While the federal administration is responsible for collecting and evaluating meteorological data and issuing good warnings within a reasonable time, as I said before, the cantons become active when severe weather warnings are issued. The processing of bulletins and warnings is carried out in cooperation of the federal government and the canton, and the local evaluation is implemented then by the cantons and the municipalities. And the latter are also mainly responsible for the intervention measures when coming to organizational measures. The central element of organizational measures is the operational documentation, which includes a flow chart, intervention cards, order sheets, and other important documents for the operation. The emergency documentation shows the different phases of operation and also defines the criteria to change from one to another phase. The experience with organizational measures has been very good so far in Switzerland. They are comparatively cheap. It is very important that these emergency concepts are developed by the local intervention forces and by natural hazard experiments together. The key point for this type of measure is that regular exercise is very, very important. If rehearsed regularly, organizational measures can be very effective. Nevertheless, there always stays a risk of failure according or due to the human interaction. Now that we have a rough overview of the measures of flood protection in Switzerland, I would like to address some current issues and draw a conclusion. I have presented to you the 3 different types of flood protection measures, and usually in a flood protection project, we have all 3 different types of measures included. It's always a combination of different measures, and usually all 3 different types are there. This is illustrated by this example of the village of Bondo in the Canton Graubünden. After a landslide, a large debris flow event occurred there, and the elaborated project consisted of the following measures. As organizational measures, light signals and a warning system, alarm system for mass movements were implemented. As a spatial planning measures, a campsite had to be abandoned. And as technical measures, a protection wall and a bedload trap were built. Some current challenges and topics that we are dealing with at the moment are collected in this slide. So first of all, I want to quickly talk about robustness in measures. It is very important for us to implement measures that are long-lasting and resilient. They should also not collapse arbitrarily during extreme events. Closely connected to this is the overload case. The dimensioning of the protection concept depends on the protection targets. However, it is our goal to always think about what happens when even more intense events occur. So how does our protection system react to this? Can we adjust our system in order to make it react smoothly? Or can we make it collapse at a certain point where we can deal with it better? What can we do then to keep the damage as low as possible? Those are questions that we are now trying to implement in new projects. Also, the management and maintenance of protection infrastructure is something that we discuss a lot nowadays in Switzerland. The main flood protection measures started in the 19th century in Switzerland, and since then flood protection measures have been implemented on rivers and streams. So a significant consequence of this is that we have many old or no longer fully functional protective structures in Switzerland. What do we do with them? Should they be renovated? Should they be reconstructed? Are they needed no longer at all? Who bears all the costs for this? How do we get a good overview of which and how many protective structures are affected? So my main message on this subject is, once a protective system is implemented, the work is far from being over. Then the maintenance and the management of the system begins. And organizational measures must be practiced and trained again and again, but also technical measures must be adapted and restored, and the entire system must be reconsidered and possibly adapted after each new event. Another topic that is currently occupying us is surface runoff or overland flow, as Caroline mentioned before. In the context of climate change, we can expect intense rainfalls to increase. And then it can happen that this intense rainfall concentrates in normally dry gullies or depression zones. So the implementation of measures to protect from overland flow is something also that is very important at the moment in Switzerland. Another point that also Caroline pointed at, but it's something that's for me personally, it's very important for me. It's the importance of the integration of all interests. And I want to point out that we are of the opinion that a flood protection project can only succeed if all affected interests, let it be agriculture, the residents, ecology, or any type of users, are included in the planning process and in the implementation. It does not, often it's not possible that everyone is 100% happy in the end, but everyone should be at least included and heard. And then often it is possible to find solutions that at least everyone can say it's okay, and you already have a good project then. So I want to draw my conclusions. I have two main conclusions. First, it is very important for us to constantly review the flood protection measures and to verify after each event how well our system has worked. I know it's work, it's a lot of work sometimes, but I am convinced that it is worth it. Because non-functioning protection systems are very dangerous, and you can learn something new from every flood event. A proper, good evaluation of an event and the existing protection system definitely pays off, in my opinion. The second main conclusion I want to make is to reiterate the importance of good hazard fundamentals. Protective measures can only be as good as the hazard and risk fundamentals we use for planning and for dimensioning. So I would like to stop with those conclusions. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I want to wish you all a good and a nice day. Thank you.